So welcome everyone again to the seventh and final week of our virtual symposium, the Kamoinge Workshop, Collaboration, Community, and Photography. Thank you so much for joining us the past 7 weeks. We are thrilled to be here tonight with you. We will have one speaker tonight, Dr. Deborah Willis, who will be delivering our keynote lecture. And then Sarah Eckhart will come back on screen for our Q&A portion. So Sarah, with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Izzy. I cannot believe that we have reached our last evening in the 7-week series. This was, as most of you know, originally planned as a 2-day symposium back in March. And of course, we had to postpone. And I don't think we could imagine when we postponed what it would look like virtually, but I think going from a 2-day symposium to a 7-evening series has actually given us so much more space for the presenters and for the artists to tell their stories. And I'm also just so deeply grateful to our audience. So I want to start by thanking you, because I could not have imagined what a committed audience we would have from around the country, actually from around the world. There were people watching internationally as well, and you have all been so engaged and asked such wonderful questions and have been so encouraging in the chat box. And so I just want to start by thanking the audience. And then I am just so thrilled that we are closing this series with a talk by Dr. Deborah Willis. And so I'm going to read, she doesn't need, I don't think, much of an introduction, because this really is her field. And so many of you know her work so well, but I'm going to read a formal introduction to Dr. Deborah Willis and then introduce and then turn it over to her. Dr. Deborah Willis is professor and chair of the Department of Photography and Imaging at the Tisch School of the Arts and director of the Institute for African American Affairs and the Center for Black Visual Culture at New York University, where she teaches courses on photography and imaging, iconicity, and cultural histories visualizing the Black body, women, and gender. Her research examines photography's multifaceted histories, visual culture, contemporary women photographers, and migration. She received the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Fellowship and a John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship. And as so many of you know, the story of Nell Draper Winston bringing Louis Draper's work to the museum, when she did that, and when I first saw this work and was so deeply impressed by it, my first stop really was to go to Deborah Willis's book, Reflections in Black, A History of Black Photographers, 1840 to the Present. And I, of course, there immediately found her writing on Louis Draper and on the Kamoinge Workshop. And I was able to immediately place him within that context due to her work. And not long thereafter, I think in 2014, I was so honored and privileged that VMFA was able to take Deborah Willis's exhibition, Posing Beauty, African American Images from the 1890s to the present. And it was just such a delight and privilege to work with her on that project and to hear from her directly about Louis Draper and the role he played in her own career. And so I'm just deeply honored to have Deborah Willis speak to us tonight about Louis Draper. And with that, I turn over the camera. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful introduction, and thanks, Izzy and Sarah. You've been great in working and putting this wonderful exhibition together. It really means a lot to be here tonight, and also I attended a few other lectures, and it's just exciting for me to see the work and recall the experiences. When I think about the work of Lou Draper, I always think of the way that he considers histories in many ways. And I want to just read a quote. He says, "I'm concerned primarily with photography's questioning and re-examination of my environment. I think that is the gift that I, as a photographer, artist, should give to my audience." So a perfect way to think about his work. His work is a gift. In the 1950s and 60s, socially concerned Black photographers and white photographers responded to political and social issues of the time and began to create images that commented on politics, culture, family, and history. This talk mediates between Lou Draper's photographs that represent images of neighborhoods in the US, areas in West Africa that he traveled, and also it concerns interests of social justice, beauty, and street photography. I first met Lou Draper when I was an undergraduate student in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia College of Art in the 70s. Then I wanted to meet photographers who were actively involved in the changing the course of photo history and fundamentally imaging Black activism and making a new photo history. I knew that Lou was a founding member of the Kamoinge workshop and that he created a broad range of images of Black life that expanded visions of various Black experiences. Lou once described members of the group as, a group working together. And thinking about that, I also wanted to walk through and look at some of his earlier images and to talk about what he meant to photography and just to imagine his history through the conversations we've had over the years. Lou Draper and his colleagues at the workshop focused their efforts on exhibiting and publishing their works. One new publication outside of the Black press, such as Ebony, Jet, Sepia, and Black Newspaper, was the Black Photographers Annual. I want to just start off with this, wonderful reflective photograph of Lou, and then to move to this image, which is a signature kind of moment of a man, as seen in many instances as John Henry, as a man returning home from work. Lou, his back is to us. It's on the cover of Camera magazine, which was a significant magazine at the time, looking at Black and white photography, looking at photography within social issues as well as political concerns. But what we see with Lou has this inside outside. He creates a narrative about work, about family, about the end of the day. And we see one man in a hat with a cigarette seated on the stoop, and then a lady leaning on the post, on the railing, as she looks far into the distance. So we just kind of imagine their experience of the day. And to see it without the Camera magazine logo, we see the top, we see the space, we see his hands in his pocket. This is a wonderful way of how Lou looks inside and outside. He is looking at, this wonderful relationship between this dog and a man with a cane, as the cane is leaning on the man's leg, but it's quietly in terms of reflecting the light that's also of the dog. And so there's a question mark in terms of the way the cane is seen. The man with a cigarette is kind of smiling, looking over at the dog, because the dog is posing. And that's, just kind of a wonderful moment. In terms of Lou's understanding of photography, he is really looking at the idea, as I mentioned earlier, the quote that I read earlier, but also just finding in his archive. I'm so excited that the museum has the archive, and that how he is looking at railings and he's designing how an image should look, and just kind of for a classroom discussion for his own work. But looking at that diagram also helps us guide to see what he sees in an image, foreground, middle ground, background, depth, color, and sense of that medium. And here's a snowy day in New York City. And there's another, in terms of an image of footsteps with Adric Cowens. It's also at the Museum of Fine Arts at the museum there in the collection. But also in 1987, I was working on the book on Black photographers, 1940 to 1985, I think, a biobibliography. And I was lucky enough to have a chance to follow up on a book I did 1840 to 1940. And the publisher said that I could do another book, without a grant. I didn't have a grant, but the opportunity I had to take advantage of, at least to get the photographers interested and find as many photographers as I could as possible, just to, if they wanted to submit 1 photograph or 10 photographs, just to include. And I wrote kind of a general letter, and I wrote over top of a letter to Lou, sorry for the late arrival. I would like to, include his photographs in there. Also, another letter that's in the archive there that I think is really central. It's in terms of understanding Lou's concern and interest in the respect that people have for him. And this is a letter from the Dean of Academic Affairs at the Mercer County Community College. And he says, your presence at the lecture demonstrate that efforts to expand the horizons of the classroom, like bringing scholars or experts to address a subject or issues, broaden the knowledge of the members of the academic community. So Lou is sharing the experience, understanding what to expand the knowledge of a place, of people. And so these letters in the collection will really enhance the next person who's going to write about him and understand his work. As I mentioned, he's observing, he's looking at the internal and external. We'll see a lot of cigarettes, manly man kind of images with men smoking, but looking at the sense of reflective, that Lou, the way this kind of stingy brim hat is tilted to the side, there's a style that's there. There's also the American flag that he's captured, the address 1781. But every day and night, Bible classes. So we see fried chicken. So we see this moment that Lou, is experiencing with walking through the streets and then capturing it and preserving it in this community. Also photographing images, 1975. And so it's amazing. This is about the time that the time I met Lou, photographing young men in their style, Kango hat, chain, one wearing a Susan B. Anthony t-shirt for his intermediate school. So we see how he is capturing the students, capturing them, and you see the backdrop is the same room and same moments. Also capturing women and rooftop, an elegant woman dressed in a very stylish gown, a fashion shoot. You can see the earrings and the necklace. We see the complete look as he's concerned and looking at beauty within the communities. He also was fascinated with reading a space in the terms of the space, which means billboards that are placed in communities, and also billboards and posters that are placed in subways. So when we look at the image on the left, we see a billboard that movie stars in this community. And so we see all of the iconic movie stars of the time, Crawford and Bogart and Peck. So we see the range and Betty Davis. And you see this figure running through, this darkened figure running through, and we see the energy in the billboard, and as if as the people are looking outside of the billboard, looking in the community. But he's able to stop motion in that way, but then also keep the motion going with these images. Also, in terms of his wide range of looking, that he doesn't overlook a quiet moment with a woman who's holding the pole on the subway. Here, again, he's capturing the time. Kent cigarette ad, a man's reading a newspaper, and a woman who's just reflecting on her moment for the day. Capturing subway images, fascinating for Lou in the times that he photographs. We can see from 66 to 77 that he's documenting newspapers. People are reading the news, staying on top of the experience, intimate moments where everyone has something to read, or overlooking someone's shoulder reading, but he's capturing these moments, understanding space in a different way that we see today specifically because of COVID, but just imagining space in the subways of New York. And again, as he's documenting in the walls on the streets, he's also looking inside people's homes, documenting the poster, the reward poster that's offered for information for an arrest and for the killers of police officers, but also this reflective moment drawing of Dr. Martin Luther King. And it's posted on the wall. It's really with tape. So you can feel the tape, you can feel the dinginess of the space and the light in the room. And then this Pepsi ad. So advertising is like central in the way. And then also you see Pepsi ad, you see this little hand holding on to this metal ad that's holding on to a Pepsi. But then we see a coffee cup at the top. And so it gives us space to breathe and imagine this person in this room. Again, images of Martin Luther King, this light bulb that's in this shop window. And so how do we see this kind of sense of light that he understands? A man with a cigar in his hand, in his mouth, as he's looking back out at Lou. So again, this inside outside, we see skates. We can't tell the depth to see if the skates are part of this man's carrying or if it's part of the scene within the window of the shop. But we appreciate the fact that Lou is looking at life, understanding and introducing his viewers to ways of seeing, capturing Malcolm X in 1963. We know it's a crowded room. We see heads, we see shapes, we see this streak of light. And so light is bouncing around, and as we see how Lou is circulating and deconstructing this moment of a portrait that also highlights an important man in our community. Photographing women and style and just the moments of the time of day and the time of year, but this defiance that's really kind of looking like you're looking at me, gaze, and I'm looking back at you. And so that hand on the hip, there's an empowerment that he captures in this image. You know, the hat, we see 80s, we see late 70s in the cars that are there. You know, this image really excited me when I see this image here. And we see the laundry on a line, on a hanger, a wire hanger. And then we see a shape of someone looking, two young people looking at a movie poster. We see this is in Dakar in 1978. And so reimagining what Lou is thinking, there is a bed frame in this image. There's a young woman in a hat. Then there are these kind of blouses that are kind of flowing in the wind. And again, we see stone walls, and the way that he's able to photograph stone walls and find the texture in these walls. Again, walls, patterns, storytelling, relationships, histories are part of that history that Lou is experiencing. This is a big blow up sign. Cuba is in the backdrop. A young girl in Philadelphia looking very tense, holding her hands. And then we see the way that her hands are crossed, and the way he photographs another photographer, Ming, and her arms are raised. And he's able also to capture this sense of reflective time and reflection. And so having this moment that, you know, he's not weary of looking at images. He's not weary of some of the things that people have painted on the wall, or as he sees the graffiti and from painting, from the decay of the walls, that he is, you know, kind of looking at these figures. And it's titled, it's untitled, but Pigeon Taking Flight in Foreground. And so we see how he's looking at ways to not only title and untitled an image, but we find a way of reading a poetry within the images. One wonderful way of reading these walls is the time. I think he's looking at the time of the year, the time of the experiences that people have of looking through histories. We imagine Coney Island and sense of joy. So the movement, the kind of Heckle and Jekyll rather, dancing on a tightrope, and the danger and moments of pleasure as we see this. And then the joy of everyday life that he's able to capture with black and white stripes at the end of the day, young girl coming home from school, carrying her sweater or her blouse and her sack. And she has white socks on, and he sees the white stripes on the crosswalk, and a young boy crossing, running, catching the light. And there's this great energy that we're experiencing with him as if we're part of the scene. And then he captures this quiet moment of the Church of Believers. And this is a church at the corner, one of the storefront churches, small churches, but we also see the end of the day, end of a school day. The way that he's able to capture children at play, girls hugging, and then these introspective moment of Langston Hughes at the typewriter. Here, he's in his office and writing, but also correcting and using the pencil to make a change, but also the typewriter is still at hand. So he's capturing Langston as in a powerful moment and a moodful in terms of the mood of writing and thinking and also reflecting. And as I mentioned earlier, there are darkened hallways and there are darkened windows and the light that Lou introduces in his work. We see the fluorescent lights, the religious icons here peering through the window, and a man going in or out, we're unsure, but he has this sense of reflective and not striking face where he is unsure if he's going in or out. And then he photographed a lot in the garment district, and the way that he's capturing them, he's creating frames within frames. A man pulling a cart, hands wrapped around the two poles, but the man who's wearing a ring, his hat. So we see hats with these two men. One, we see his back, the other, we see his face coming and looking forward, but he's moving forward and he's capturing these moments. Here's another one that's captivating in the way that this man is also working in the fashion and the garment district. We see a rope, we see a man who's very, very stylish in terms of the way he looks, his leather coat and his fur collar, and then the sign, "Don't walk," but people are moving and in the stillness of this experience that we see in the memory that this man is not looking at Lou, but Lou is capturing this whole scene, and then the way that it's separated in 3 different sections based on the pull cart. Here, the Dime Savings Bank that's no longer here in New York City, a very popular bank in Brooklyn, had big signs and posters, but the sign, "Grow Rich," and then this bank book that's seen, and then the way that the 2 children who are walking with their white shirts on in opposite directions, and Lou is guiding this direction with our view of Grow Rich. It's kind of humorous to see, but also a haircut in Dakar. Looking at these 2 images together where people are walking in different directions. One is a woman walking forward, and then the quiet moment where a young boy is getting his hair cut, and then the sign of the advertising sign of the barber. And with this image here in the 1960s, street corner, the young boy is looking directly into the camera, and I'm not sure of this actual scene, but we see that Lou is capturing the city. A man with his hat, a policeman on the corner. So there's a lot of terms of observation and looking in this scene. And I wanted just to compare the other image of the wall on the upper left to this wall on the right. When we think of how graffiti is created and how images are created, we see the way that Lou is looking, not only in downtown, he's uptown, he's looking at the stairs, and it looks like it could be Inwood or some area uptown in that way, or Amsterdam or the Upper West Side. But we see this wonderful drawing of a figure, a very strong masculine figure that's oversized, and then again the legs at the bottom. So I'm not sure if this is if it's an old billboard that's decaying, but what's left that he's capturing. And then also this is in Atlanta, Georgia, where he photographs key figures. We see Coltrane, we see Angela Davis, and we see Muhammad Ali. And the sense and the sign and the title is called Trombonist. And we see this man walking, gesture, just blowing his horn. So when Lou captures that, we see diagonal lines, we see the experience of shapes and movement. And his involvement with photographing the Black Caucus, and Fannie Lou Hamer in an article in Essence magazine, October 1971. Here we see Lou photographing her directly as she looks directly into the camera. But then also knowing her history as a sharecropper, he's capturing her scene, the experience of her. The title says, Fannie Lou Hamer Speaks Out, and this quiet look as she looks directly into Lou's camera. But then these other images that he has of her on his contact sheet as she's walking the road that she's traveled often. And we see how wonderful and powerful Lou is trying to assert her sense of being, her work. His contact sheet shows the range of images that he chose, that he selected, what he did not select, but also the land that the people worked on, and why it was important for Fannie to run for office and to speak out. And also photographing here, it says Revolt Now. This is what's on the wall, but he's also carried, three Orthodox members of the Jewish community walking in New York, and the man looking directly at Lou into the camera. And then this Revolt Now, unknown what it means, but he captures this. And he understands what does a revolt mean at this point and now. And again, reading walls, reading the communities. And he also was published in Photography at Mid-Century. It was at George Eastman House, an exhibition in 1959. Important experience for him. It was not many Black photographers were a part of that. And we see the image here in the frame. Also in 1976, a book, Exposure, work by 10 photographers, and this, 2 of the images that were part of this book, the Creative Artists Public Service Program, and which collected photographs by Black and white and Latino and Asian photographers at the time. And again, whoever selected this understood Black and white photography, understood the significance of the images that Lou submitted, and selected, his wall images and these iconic images of people in their communities. He also photographed Kathy and Eve Sandler, who are artists, filmmaker and artist working in New York in the 70s and 80s. And it's just wonderful that he's able to, and he photographed them in their homes, but also capturing two sisters. And these are some of the contact sheets. I was really excited to find and discover images that were part of, I was part of the image in terms of a reception at Kathy's. And you see that, and I remember taking the camera, and it was sometime in the 80s, Lou's camera, and making a photograph of Lou in this, and this contact sheet really meant a lot because Lou lost, could not locate these images for a long time, and so was really glad to have an opportunity to see these images. Another 1971 image of the Black Caucus, and this was part of the Fannie Lou, he photographed that in the Fannie Lou Hamer Speaks Out Essence magazine. This is the cover of the 1971 issue of Essence. So I'd like to end here and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And I'm so glad you talked as much as you did, or noticed as much how Lou looks at walls and texture on walls and murals, because I feel like it is a through line through his entire body of work, and really through Kamoinge, through a number of the artists. There seems to be a whole dialogue around messages that are on walls, and a back and forth about some of these messages. I'm just always grateful for your insight and for all of the things that particular things that you see in these images. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about that moment in the mid-1970s when you met Louis Draper, and the field of the history of African American photography. Can you just tell us a little bit about what it was like on the ground at that moment when you were writing your paper, and you reached out to Lou, as you wrote in your preface?
Well, he was missing from my history books. You know, all of Black photographers were missing from my history books, but I had Ann Tucker as a professor. She understood the lack of diversity in writing about Black photographers, and she knew Lou and knew some of the photographers from the Kamoinge workshop, and she suggested that you know, I reach out, if you know, because I of course asked the question, like, where are they and why aren't they here? No one else asked the questions. Many of the images that people that my professors were showing at the time were of kind of what's called now poverty porn, in terms of, you know, the images of Black people. So it's trauma. Yes, we've had trauma and we've had difficult experience, but we've also had other experiences in our lives. And I wanted to create a visual narrative that had a broader history, a broader visual reference to Black life. And it was important for me to find it. And I knew that it existed because of the photographers who lived in Philadelphia. And so that experience was really central for me to kind of locate photographers, and then also to have an exchange of photographers who were really interested in sharing their work. And Lou was really open, and Joe Crawford was excited about you know, my call and my research and understanding as a young photographer, and Ming as well. So Lou was, he mentored me, and he mentored others. And that's why I really felt that Lou, as a mentor, that he had insight into the needs of a young photographer, or needs of other photographers, and also needs of the community. So in terms of mentoring, he was open to listening, and a close listener at that.
Yeah, he seemed to be thinking kind of about both things in that, the history and supporting the young artists. So he seemed to be very aware of both generations, and Kamoinge really kind of being in between those two generations. So he in the Black Photographers Annual, especially the second annual in 1976, there seemed to be a really, or 74, I guess, a concerted effort to bring back some of those figures like P.H. Polk, and of course Van der Zee, but to think about but doing that in thinking about a younger generation of photographers who were practicing, who needed that, who wanted to see that history, and so you were really you were both a practicing photographer and you were focused on the history of photography.
It was important for me, Anne mentored me in a way that I reference a lot, and the fact that because I knew I wanted to become a photographer at the time, I wanted to write about photography, but I also knew that I needed to talk to photographers, and to have meeting Lou at the time, I also met Danny Dawson and some others at the time who were close listeners and understood my need to be a part of that, and so that was central. I remember also I was living in New Jersey, and I met Gail Buckland, who also was writing about photography at the time, and so we had a chance to exchange ideas about research. So research was central for me in the 70s as a student, and also the archive was central for me, and having that opportunity to expand the archive was something that I felt was really important at that time.
And I saw you showed the CAPS, Creative Arts, I think of the full title.
Yeah.
Those grants were, Lou received one, but then I noticed that he became a juror. And I think Dawood Bey talked about how Lou was very encouraging of younger photographers then applying for those grants, and making sure that they were getting their name out there, and they were getting their images out there. And he talked about Lou being willing to just meet you in a diner and talk about your work, and how needed that was, just that you're talking about him as a listener. And it's just been such a privilege to hear. I never got to meet Louis Draper, but to hear the different stories of the ways in which he was very generous with his time and mentoring.
And it was also important that the CAPS grants, that one photograph was housed in a collection, had to be in a museum collection. And so the CAPS grants gave photographers an opportunity to have their works in collections. And from the Museum of New York to the Met to MoMA, all of them had these opportunities that I'm not sure who collected and who still has them, but I know that was one of the missions of the CAPS grant, to make sure that museums had a diverse collection.
Yeah, and also Ann Tucker has been, I've seen her name in the chat session, so it's been wonderful. She's been in the audience, I think. I'm not sure about tonight, but over the course of the symposium. So all of the connections that have come through this project have been amazing. And I also got to talk with Eve Sandler today. I see that she's in the chat box about the photographs, the lost wedding photographs, which is in itself is an incredible story, because they're such amazing images. But that they found their way, or they finally have found their way
into a museum collection as well, right?
Yeah, but just the strikingly beautiful photographs that Lou also made of Eve and her sister Kathy Sandler and their mother Joan Sandler also gives you that sense of Lou's, just his vision and the kinds of portraits that he could make that really.
Yeah, family was central to him, and as well as community. He invited me to speak at Mercer County twice, and going out to Trenton to take the train, and understanding that neither without cars, but we were mobile, but there was a sense of pride that I felt when I was with him, and we shared moment. And that meant a lot in terms of that.
And you've talked a little bit about the shared Virginia.
Oh yeah, right. Because we were talking because my father's family is from Orange County, Virginia, and family in Richmond and Goochland and all in Louisa. So we were always talking about the Virginia connection. So that was always so special. But also having the way that he photographed cities made cities small in terms of they didn't seem big and difficult to imagine and to handle, and the intimacy that he offered his viewers about a city like New York or the Fashion District or Harlem. There were people held on to some of those images as they could see them.
And I'm just going to read Ann Tucker's comment because I feel like it's worth reading out loud. She said, "I'm here. Thank you, Deb, for your sweet comment, but you did the monumental work that needed to be done," which is absolutely true. So I felt that should be read out loud. And you have done the monumental work, and I'm grateful.
Well, I'm grateful that you understood the importance of having posing beauty at the museum, but also having the bandwidth to and the support to create the exhibition and have everyone there. And finding support for exhibitions on Black artists, it's difficult. I mean, I know because no one supported any of my projects, and it's unbelievable, that everything that I did was constant, handout, trying to make it work with, working jobs and giving talks. And then it was so wonderful to get the Guggenheim, who, when I wrote, it was for Posing Beauty, and to have that support was central, and it's great. You can get the book out and try to get support to get the exhibition moving and having these opportunities. And so having the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts and then going to the Whitney later to have this exhibition, and then to have a companion book. So I applaud, the museum for that support. And Lou's sister, who was determined to preserve her brother's collection.
But it really is tremendous. Nell's just been so tenacious. She's such a humble and quiet woman, but she is such a committed force for good in this city. And she will not, she will never talk about herself. But she has her own kind of civil rights history here in the city, where she was present. She was a part of the sit-ins here. She's done so much for this city. And I think that part of what she did was preserve her brother's work and make sure that it found the right place. But I have to say, I was just talking with Valerie Cassell Oliver today about what it is meant to be at an institution that, from seeing Lou's work, running to the chief curator to show it, from proposing the exhibition, there has been support from the top down. It was just the work was so clearly phenomenal, and the story was so important as an American story, not just a Richmond story and a New York story, but this is clearly a much larger story. And I have to say that I have had incredible support from the institution from the get-go, and I am so grateful to be at an institution that is willing to do that, because, it's very hard to get a catalog usually at a museum.
Exactly. And, just to think that Tony Barboza and Herb Randall did the Timeless book at a crucial time to collect all of the photographers together to have, a big book to recognize not only the history of Kamoinge, but also the earlier years of what Joe Crawford did with that with Buford Smith. So you can see these bodies coming together to hold, and then to see that Ming Smith has a new book coming out, with Aperture. So it's just, people say the books, people will complain about books are not, viable, but they are. And the, the support that publishers are trying to give at this time, it's really important at this time.
That fits with the question Mia Fanar is asking, Al Fanar's daughter. And just saying Mia Fanar's name makes me want to just talk about also the incredible support
his work too. I love
yeah, just the incredible support of the artists themselves and the role they've played in this, because they've all been so gracious with their time in helping not just to produce the exhibition, but to help decipher Lou's archive. There were so many questions, and I could just get on the phone and ask somebody or send an email with a contact sheet and get an answer back about who was in an image. And it was an incredible experience. But Mia points out with the end of a 3-year run of Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, and the beginning of the Working Together tour, do you see more historic Black fine art photography exhibits in the future? And
yes.
What do you think those might be?
I see it. I see that, this pandemic people are calling me like nonstop, and people are trying to, with the experience of the social protests now, are trying to say that, okay, we know we need to make a difference. We need to do something for the future. And so having this exhibition that's going to travel, I'm sure you're going to get many requests in the future, and hopefully, it could move forward. But I just think that just to let her know that her father's work was true art for me. It was just so wonderful to meet him and to see his artful, his aesthetic images that really helped me kind of find vision, of creating work. And then also preserving my interest and hopeful to stay with making images.
And I have another question about, did you ever get to see Lou teach a photography class? This is from Sheree Cochran, who was a research assistant for this project and spent a lot of time immersed in Lou's teaching notes as well. And if you do remember watching him teach a photography class, what were your impressions of his teaching practice?
Oh yeah, when I was invited to be a guest artist at Mercer County, he was in the midst of his class, so we shared the class, and he of course using slides, but just like that drawing that I showed early on, that he could dissect a photograph, understand what angles mean and why they're in relationship to something that's across on the other side, what it's reflecting. Like also, like I showed you the image that Adger Cowens did with the snow, and then the image that he also did, a snow image. And so, but you can see the two images in terms of what photographers are looking outside, over in a window, outside of a window, but also he was able to take us through, and I remember it so wonderfully because I had a professor at Philadelphia College of the Arts at the time, Ray Metzger, and he taught the same way. He would help you imagine the moment and relive it, and then also preserve it by helping you print. Mm-hmm. So when he could understand the qualities of a black and white image and what it meant to process it at how long in terms of temperature, he'd work through the image with the individual student and sit down at the table with them. And so there were moments that were just wonderful to experience. And I had been out of school for a while, out of the studio classroom, and I just enjoy it. And I learned a lot from that because I I give the same in terms of a critique in that way when I teach photography. And it's sometimes painful, you know, because, you know, really want a student to understand the vibrancy of an image and also to see, help them guide through the image. And it's different now, but we had patience then.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the whole Luz Mercer.
My light is changing. I'm gonna just.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
His whole career at Mercer, I mean, it's like, that could be a whole other book. And in fact, the Mercer Community College, Gary Zaretsky's been tuning in. He's probably here tonight too. And several of the artists worked to produce a beautiful book of Luz's work. But those years at Mercer, really his teaching, he taught from really the late 60s all the way through to Mercer. What we have in the archive, we have a lot of his teaching material from that period at Mercer, where he was so important to the photography department. But I can't help but think or wish that I could know the names of all of the people, not necessarily just photographers, but people that he taught and mentored. Because one of the things that struck me, this kind of connection with Kamoinge, was their statement about reflecting truth in the world. And then this picture we have from one of his contact sheets where he's teaching students in Brooklyn as part of the Youth in Action program, and you can see the word truth over his shoulder. Mm-hmm. And so you know that he's teaching. There's another slide where he's with Ray Francis, and it's all kinds of technical information and diagrams. And so he's teaching that technical knowledge that's so needed. And his standards, you know, I know from hearing from so many people that worked with him, were so high, especially in printing in the darkroom. But then that word truth really communicates to me a whole other level at which he was mentoring what it meant to make images and what people.
Yeah, because he was battling that history of images that were circulating at the time that denigrated Black communities and didn't really show a broad history or a broad representation. And so it was important for him to appreciate a woman who's wearing a hat in a stylish way, or who's out, two girls hanging out with their hands on the hip and say, you know, look at my power. So that's something that if we want to think about truth and preserving truth, I think that that's something that he was able to, you know, not only suggest in his image, but to suggest that these are alternate lives that have been ignored, and these lives were important to photograph. And looking at his contact sheet for the Fannie Lou Hamer shoot just was so inclusive, and all of what she talked about, you know, about Black labor, you know, about land, about being disenfranchised. So all of that is there on that contact sheet.
And to bring it back to your show, this sense of truth and seeing these images, somebody wrote into the comment section, Terry Ann Watts, I got to take my daughter to the Posing Beauty exhibit when it was at the VMFA. We went on Mother's Day. It will always be one of my favorite memories with my daughters. So I just share that experience since it's there, because I think the viewer is the other, you know, the truth he was conveying both to younger photographers, I think to a lot of students who didn't necessarily go on to be photographers, but learn to see images differently through his teaching.
But also the people who visit the museum, I really think it's important that people need to see, you know, it's not just Black people who need to see our beauty, you know what I mean? That people need to recognize there's a broad range. It's like, oh, I didn't know these images existed. You know, I didn't know this history, and let me learn more about it. And this is why, you know, we need the K-12 people taking kids into the museums, or if we can't get into museums now, is to teach from these books that are source books to show a reference in that way. So it's really important to express these broad histories.
Which is one of the things that makes me happy about his work coming to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, because we're a state museum. We have a wonderful education department who works closely with the K through 12 teachers. And so when an image comes into the museum, it doesn't often just go on the wall, it can become a resource for teachers. And so then these become the images that teachers use throughout the state in their standards of learning. And so that reach, again, to return to Nell Draper Winston, I feel like this was, you know, this is very much a part of her hope and her plan, was that his work would reach those audiences beyond Virginia. But in Virginia, we have, you know, we're, as a state museum, we're very invested or committed to the K through 12 kind of age group. And somebody, actually Mia, wants to know if you would tell us about your background, on your Zoom background.
Oh, my background. Yeah. Okay. So there's a new book, Aperture. This is a Carrie Mae Weems recreation of the photograph of the sweet potato planters in South Carolina. And the new book is just published with, and of course my mind is like, ooh, with Aperture. And it's a book looking at the Zealy daguerreotypes that Molly Rogers and Lisa Barbash and I, we edited with 10 other authors who wrote about the legacy of the daguerreotypes. Carrie and I had an interview about her own work, reflecting on the daguerreotypes, but also her work about the South and her experience of making images from her early periods of the 80s to now, but also looking at the work and labor of Black people. And so it just came out to make their way into the world, the enduring legacy of the Zealy daguerreotypes.
I'm so glad that Mia asked, because that was wonderful. Wonderful to be able to, I think, close talking about what's next. I can't believe we reached.
What's next? Next for my book is called Black Civil War Soldier.
Okay.
Conflict and Citizenship, New York University Press. Virginia is in there heavily, Richmond too. But I was interested in the absence of stories, visual stories of Black soldiers. When I was in school, no Blacks, you know, Lincoln, Freed, and all of those stories. And I wanted to just kind of curious about, and as archives are opening up, I was curious about these Black soldiers and where these archives have been housed at Library of Congress and at Beinecke, of course, Schaumburg, and in Boston, also in Richmond. And I wanted to just look at portraits of Black soldiers and then find their letters, because we were also told that, you know, Black people were illiterate. I wanted to find their stories. They wrote letters. They also had they wrote newspaper articles about their experiences in the war. They made photographs. A mother found her son marching in Richmond, saying, "Who's your mother? I mean, what was your name?" In 20 years, she looked for her son, and he was one of the soldiers. And it was just it's just a fascinating story that, and I have about 100 some odd images, 125 or 30 images, that it's been with me for a long time. When I worked at the Smithsonian, you know, I met some of the collectors who wanted to share their images, but we couldn't purchase them at the time. But now that they're in public collections, I had an opportunity to write and to research some of their letters, and the letters are just fascinating, and women too. So I have women who wrote about how they taught Black soldiers who were formerly enslaved to read and write, so that they could also sign when they were paid. Some of them were not paid properly, and they would put an X, but they were determined to learn how to write their names. And so they were the stories that I wanted to explore. So that's coming out in January.
Yeah, soon. We will. There's a lot of excitement generated in the chat box over while you were talking.
New York University Press, look at their website, so it's great.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you for all of the images in the chat. I wish I could see the chat.
Oh, sorry that you're not able to pull that up, but yes, there's yeah, a lot of, as we've had, I want to thank the audience again, just because it's really been so encouraging. These chat boxes you don't normally get during a regular symposium. You don't get to see,
Yeah.
and it's actually for any complaining people might do about Zoom, I have to say it's been lovely. It's just been really
well, thank you for a wonderful evening, and hi to as many friends who I know who might be out there.
Gail Buckland said thank you, Deb, for all you've done and continue to do. I continue to learn from you, and I've learned from you for over 40 years. So
yeah, we had fun in Westfield and Plainfield, New Jersey. Yeah. Okay.
And I want to thank Izzy Fuqua as well, just for the tremendous effort and coordination she put into 7 weeks. So this has been a labor of love. It's been wonderful, but I want to thank her for that as well. So thank you, Izzy. And thank you, Deborah. This has been wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.